Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the wide avenues of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, where the world's largest city rose from the plains of China 13 centuries ago, before London was little more than scattered villages, before Paris had built its first cathedral, before the world knew what a true metropolis could look like. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk boulevards wider than any road in medieval Europe, where Persian merchants traded beside Buddhist monks, where Japanese scholars studied poetry next to Arab astronomers, where the morning market filled with silk and spices from 1,000 miles away. We stand before temple gates painted red and gold, where incense smoke curled into morning air and bells rang out across neighbourhoods home to 1 million souls. We imagine the poets who gathered in wine shops beneath willow trees, writing verses that would echo through centuries, capturing the beauty of a moment that seemed eternal but was always slipping away. Each episode here isn't just about dynasties and emperors. It's not about memorising dates or battles or the rise and fall of kingdoms catalogued in textbooks. It's about the lives lived, the singing girl performing in a tavern at dusk, the foreign trader bargaining in broken Chinese, the child watching acrobats flip and dance in a crowded square, wondering if the whole world was as magical as this golden city. It's about the beauty they created, the tolerance they practiced, the dreams they carried, the questions that still whisper across the centuries, waiting patiently for us to listen, to wonder, to remember. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. The year is 618 and China bleeds. For decades, the Great Sui dynasty has torn itself apart through overambition and cruelty, forcing millions to build canals and walls while famine stalks the countryside and rebellion burns in every province. The Grand Canal, that impossible feat of engineering stretching hundreds of miles from north to south, has been completed at the cost of countless lives. Peasants have abandoned their fields, soldiers have deserted their posts, and warlords have carved the empire into competing kingdoms, each claiming the mandate of heaven while the land itself seems to weep for peace. In the north, near the old Han Dynasty capital, a city called Chang'an sits half-ruined and nearly forgotten. Once it had been the heart of an empire, but that was centuries ago, before the fall of the Han, before the long darkness of division, when China splintered into warring states and barbarian kingdoms ruled the north. Now Chang'an is little more than a regional centre, its walls crumbling, its palaces overgrown with weeds, its population a fraction of what it once was. Dust blows through empty streets where emperors once rode in procession. Wild grass grows in the courtyards of abandoned mansions. The glory days seem impossibly distant, like stories told by grandparents about a golden age that perhaps never really existed at all. But something is stirring in the ruins. A general named Li Yuan, descended from both Chinese and nomadic Xianbei aristocracy, has seized control of Chang'an with the help of his brilliant son Li Shimin. They are not the first warlords to claim the city, and at first, they do not seem destined to be the last. The empire is still fractured, still bleeding, still tearing itself apart in a dozen civil wars that show no sign of ending. Yet Li Yuan declares himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Tang, taking the imperial name Gaozu, and his son begins the brutal work of reunifying China through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and a vision of what the empire could become if only the fighting would stop. The old Chang'an is too small for their ambitions, too damaged by neglect and war, too haunted by the ghosts of failed dynasties, and so, in 622, Emperor Gaozu makes a decision that will echo through history. He orders the construction of a new city, a magnificent capital built on a scale the world has never seen, laid out according to ancient principles of cosmic order and Confucian harmony, designed to accommodate not thousands but hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million people. The plans are drawn by architects who study the classics, who measure the heavens and consult geomancers about auspicious alignments. The new Chang'an will be a perfect square, 9 miles on each side, its streets running north to south and east to west in a grid so precise that a visitor could navigate it, blindfolded simply by counting intersections. The walls rise first, rammed earth faced with brick, 30 feet high and thick enough that 6 horses could ride abreast along the top. Watchtowers punctuate the walls at regular intervals, and 12 gates pierce the fortifications, 3 on each side, their names invoking peace and virtue and eternal spring. Inside the walls, the city is divided into more than 100 rectangular wards, each surrounded by its own walls with gates that close at curfew, transforming the capital into a city of cities, a labyrinth of neighbourhoods where officials and merchants and craftsmen and farmers and foreigners will eventually live in a density unprecedented in human history. At the northern end of the city, the imperial palace complex spreads across hundreds of acres, its buildings oriented to catch the southern sun, its halls and gates and gardens designed to manifest the emperor's role as the son of heaven, the intermediary between earth and cosmos. South from the palace, the main avenue, called the Street of the Vermilion Sparrow, stretches more than 3 miles to the southern gate, so wide that it could accommodate 100 men walking shoulder to shoulder. Lesser avenues and streets divide the city into its grid, and canals bring water from distant mountains, ensuring that even in drought, the city will not thirst. This is the skeleton of greatness, the framework upon which a golden age will be built. But in 622, it is still mostly empty, still more dream than reality, still waiting for the people who will fill it with life and noise and colour and the 1,000 daily dramas of human existence. The question hanging in the air, unspoken but present in every decision, every brick laid, every street surveyed, is whether China has seen the last of its civil wars, whether the Tang dynasty will endure long enough to fill this magnificent city, or whether it will join the Sui and so many others in the graveyard of failed ambitions. The answer will come sooner than anyone expects, and it will change everything. The archaeologist kneels in the dirt outside modern Xi'an, brushing dust from a fragment of glazed pottery, and realizes she is touching the edge of something vast. The year is 1973, and China is slowly emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, that decade of political upheaval when Red Guards destroyed temples and burned books and persecuted scholars in the name of revolutionary purity. Ancient sites were vandalized, artifacts smashed, and the study of history itself became dangerous, tainted by association with the feudal past. But now, carefully, tentatively, archaeologists are returning to the field, and beneath the modern city of Xi'an, they are finding the buried remains of Tang dynasty Chang'an, layer upon layer of a civilization that once dazzled the world. The pottery shard in the archaeologist's hand is not Chinese. She turns it over slowly, noting the distinctive glaze, the colour, the craftsmanship. Persian, she thinks, or perhaps from further west, from lands that Tang dynasty records called Da-Chin, the Roman Orient. The shard comes from a layer dated to the 8th century, the height of Tang power, and it is not alone. Around it, excavation reveals fragments of glass from Syria, coins from Arabia, beads from India, textiles from Central Asia. This single test trench, dug at what Tang maps indicate was once the West Market, contains artifacts from half the known world, physical proof that Chang'an was not just a Chinese city but a global crossroads, where East met West in ways that would not be seen again for centuries. The excavations expand slowly, constrained by funding and politics and the simple fact that a modern city of millions sits atop the ancient capital. But every new trench, every careful survey, reveals more wonders. Here, the foundations of a Buddhist temple that once housed monks from India and Ceylon and Korea. There, the remains of a Zoroastrian fire temple, where Persian refugees worshipped the god Ahura Mazda thousands of miles from their conquered homeland. In another location, evidence of a Nestorian Christian church, its stone tablets inscribed in Chinese and Syriac, proving that the faith reached China centuries before Europeans imagined sailing to Asia. The street grid emerges from aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar, and the archaeologists realize with growing astonishment that the Tang sources were not exaggerating. Chang'an truly was laid out in a perfect grid, its main avenues genuinely as wide as the records claimed, some measuring more than 500 feet across, broader than any street in medieval Paris or London or Baghdad. The city covered more than 30 square miles within its walls, and evidence suggests that at its height, it housed at least 1 million people, possibly more, making it larger than any other city on Earth in the 8th century. One archaeologist, a specialist in urban planning, spends months reconstructing the layout from fragments of evidence, cross-referencing Tang Dynasty maps and poems and administrative documents with physical remains. He produces a detailed reconstruction showing 108 wards, each a walled neighbourhood with its own character and population. The eastern wards housed aristocrats and high officials in sprawling mansions with gardens and artificial lakes. The western wards were denser, more commercial, home to merchants and craftsmen and the markets that fed the city. The southern wards, near the gates that opened toward the Silk Road, were the most cosmopolitan, their streets filled with foreign traders and translators and the kind of people who make their living between cultures. In one dramatic excavation in 1987, workers uncovering a foundation for a new building stumble upon a Tang Dynasty wine shop, its storage jar still intact, the shop's account books miraculously preserved in the dry soil. The documents are transcribed with painstaking care, and they reveal a business that served customers from across Asia. Here, a Korean student bought wine on credit, promising to pay when funds arrived from home. There, a Japanese monk purchased rice wine and paid in silver coins minted in Nara. Another entry records a Persian merchant ordering grape wine, the drink of his homeland, available in Chang'an because vineyards had been planted specifically to serve the city's foreign population. The discovery that moves researchers most profoundly comes in 2003, when excavations in what was once the East Market uncover a series of skeletons buried in a common grave. Analysis of bones and teeth reveals individuals of East Asian, Central Asian, and possibly European ancestry, men and women and children who died together, perhaps in a fire or epidemic, and were buried without ceremony in the 8th century. DNA testing is impossible with the technology available, but isotope analysis of tooth enamel shows that many of them grew up far from Chang'an, consuming water and food from distant regions before eventually making their way to the great city. They are nameless now, these forgotten people. Their stories lost to time, but their bones tell a story of movement and mixture, of a city that drew people from the edges of the known world and made them part of something larger than themselves. They came seeking opportunity or safety or simply something different from what their homelands offered, and they found it in the crowded wards and bustling markets of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, where a Sogdian trader could marry a Chinese woman, where a Korean student could become a celebrated poet, where a Persian refugee could worship his god without fear. The excavations continue year after year, each season revealing new fragments of a lost world. And with each discovery the picture becomes clearer. Chang'an was not just large, it was unprecedented, a city that achieved a level of cosmopolitan sophistication that would not be matched again until the modern era. The question archaeologists now ask is not whether the Tang sources exaggerated, but whether they captured even half the truth of what this extraordinary city really was. When the first detailed reports from the Chang'an excavations reach international academic conferences in the 1980s, the response is divided between wonder and profound skepticism. Western historians trained in European medieval studies struggle to accept the numbers. 1 million people in 8th century China? That would make Chang'an 5 times larger than Constantinople, 10 times larger than Paris, more populous than any European city would be until the 19th century. The claim seems preposterous, tainted by nationalist pride or methodological error, or simple misunderstanding of Tang Dynasty population records. One prominent French historian publishes a paper arguing that Chinese sources systematically exaggerated urban populations, that the million figure must refer to the entire province, not the city itself, that no pre-modern society could have fed and housed and governed such numbers without modern technology. But the Chinese archaeologists have done their homework. They present evidence systematically, building their case brick by brick, street by street. Here are the walls, measured and mapped, enclosing 33 square miles. Here are the ward foundations, 108 of them, each capable of housing thousands. Here are the granaries, massive structures that stored tax grain shipped from across the empire via the Grand Canal. Here are the wells, hundreds of them, showing a sophisticated understanding of urban water management. Here are the latrines and drainage systems, proving that Tang Dynasty engineers understood sanitation in ways medieval Europe would not match for centuries. The food supply question is addressed through careful analysis of Tang administrative documents, which meticulously recorded grain shipments, tax revenues, and population registers. The empire's canal system, built at such terrible cost during the Sui dynasty, turns out to have been crucial. Grain from the fertile Yangtze River Valley could be shipped north to Chang'an, supplementing local agriculture and allowing the capital to support a population far beyond what its immediate hinterland could feed. The system was not perfect, and famines did occur when harvests failed or canals silted up, but for most of the Tang dynasty's golden age, it worked remarkably well. Japanese scholars enter the debate with crucial evidence from their own country's records. Japan sent regular embassies to Tang China, and the Japanese ambassadors kept detailed journals of their visits to Chang'an. These accounts, preserved in Japanese imperial archives, corroborate the Chinese sources. One ambassador in the year 733 writes of streets so crowded that his delegation took hours to traverse the city from the southern gate to the palace. Another describes the West Market as requiring an entire day to explore properly, its shops and stalls selling goods from across the known world. The Japanese sources have no reason to exaggerate Chinese greatness, yet they consistently portray Chang'an as overwhelmingly vast and populous. Korean scholars contribute similar evidence. The Kingdom of Silla, in Southeast Korea, modelled its own capital of Gyeongju directly on Chang'an, and Korean records describe the Tang capital with a mixture of envy and admiration. They note the width of the streets, the organisation of the wards, the sophistication of the palace protocol. One Korean scholar official, writing in the early 8th century, laments that his own country's capital, though impressive by Korean standards, seems provincial and small after visiting Chang'an, where even minor aristocrats live in mansions that would be palaces in Korea. The skeptics slowly retreat, though some never quite surrender their doubts. The evidence becomes overwhelming. Chang'an was genuinely enormous, genuinely cosmopolitan, genuinely one of the great achievements of pre-modern urban planning. But even as the debate about size subsides, new questions emerge. How did a medieval Chinese city become so international? What drew people from Persia and Arabia and Central Asia to make the long, dangerous journey to the Tang capital? And perhaps most intriguingly, how did the Tang dynasty manage religious and ethnic diversity on a scale that caused bitter conflict in many other pre-modern societies? One American historian specializing in comparative urbanism publishes a groundbreaking study in 1995, comparing Chang'an to other major pre-modern cities, Baghdad, Rome, Constantinople, Teotihuacan. Her conclusion surprises even her colleagues. In terms of planning, infrastructure, and cosmopolitan sophistication, Chang'an ranks among the greatest urban achievements in human history, comparable to anything produced by Rome at its height, and in some ways more impressive precisely because it had no direct models to follow. The Romans built upon Greek precedents, but Tang China was creating something fundamentally new, a capital city designed from first principles to be the centre of a universal empire. The academic consensus slowly shifts from skepticism to recognition. Chang'an was real, it was extraordinary, and understanding why it succeeded where so many other pre-modern cities failed becomes one of the central questions in Asian history. The answer, researchers increasingly realize, lies not just in economics or engineering or politics, but in something more subtle and profound. The Tang dynasty, at least during its golden age, developed a remarkably inclusive vision of civilization, one that welcomed foreigners and foreign ideas while maintaining a strong Chinese cultural identity. This balance, so difficult to achieve and so easy to lose, made Chang'an not just the largest city in the world, but also one of the most dynamic and creative. The wonder, scholars agree, is not that Chang'an eventually declined, but that it achieved greatness at all, and that it maintained that greatness for more than a century, long enough to leave an indelible mark on world history. The skepticism gives way to a deeper curiosity. What was it like, they ask, to walk those streets, to live in those wards, to be part of that extraordinary moment when 1 million souls from across Eurasia came together and built something unprecedented? The Tang dynasty poets describe Chang'an as paradise on earth, a city where spring blossoms never faded and music drifted eternally from wine shops and palace gardens. Reading their verses 13 centuries later, it is easy to believe that the capital existed in a state of perpetual grace, that its streets were always clean, its people always prosperous, its government always wise and just. The poetry shimmers with golden light and impossible beauty, painting a picture of urban perfection that seems too good to be true. And of course, it was. The archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story, one of crowding and poverty alongside splendour, of ethnic tensions beneath the cosmopolitan surface, of environmental degradation caused by housing 1 million people in a pre-modern city. The contradiction between legend and reality runs through every aspect of Chang'an's history, forcing historians to navigate carefully between the poet's idealization and the cynical assumption that nothing good can be wholly true. Consider the famous West Market, celebrated in Tang poetry, as a place of endless wonders where merchants from every nation displayed silks and spices and precious stones from the ends of the earth. The poets were not entirely wrong. The market did exist, it was genuinely international, and it did offer goods available nowhere else in China. But excavations reveal that the market district was also a place of desperate poverty, where migrants from the countryside and failed foreign traders lived in conditions of shocking squalor. The same ward that housed wealthy Persian merchants also contained slums where people lived 10 to a room, where disease spread through crowded tenements, where children died young, and bodies were sometimes left unburied because no one could afford funeral rites. The poetry rarely mentions the poor, except as picturesque figures in the background of larger scenes. But Tang administrative documents tell a different story. Chang'an had a permanent underclass of servants, labourers, and migrants who did the unglamorous work of keeping the city functioning. They hauled water, collected night soil, swept streets, slaughtered animals, prepared corpses for burial, and performed the 100 other tasks that made urban life possible, but which polite society preferred not to discuss. Many were legally enslaved, bought and sold in markets that also traded horses and silk. Others were technically free but trapped in debt bondage, or simply too poor to leave the city even when conditions became unbearable. The environmental reality of Chang'an also contradicts the poet's vision of a harmonious garden city. 1 million people produced enormous amounts of waste, and while the Tang government maintained public latrines and drainage systems, these were chronically overwhelmed. Human waste was collected and sold to farmers as fertilizer, but the collection was never efficient enough. Streets, particularly in poorer wards, often ran with sewage. The smell during summer must have been overwhelming, though the poets tactfully never mention it, preferring to write about plum blossoms and autumn moons. Deforestation around Chang'an became a serious problem by the mid-8th century. The city consumed vast quantities of wood for construction, heating and cooking, and the nearby forests were stripped bare within decades. Fuel had to be brought from ever more distant mountains, driving up prices and forcing the poor to burn inferior coal that filled their homes with toxic smoke. The air quality during winter, when hundreds of thousands of fires burned simultaneously, was probably appalling by modern standards, contributing to respiratory diseases that killed especially the young and old. The cosmopolitan harmony celebrated in official propaganda also had its limits. While the Tang dynasty was genuinely more tolerant than many pre-modern societies, ethnic and religious tensions simmered beneath the surface. Chinese Confucian scholars sometimes resented the influence of foreign merchants and Buddhist monks. There were periodic purges of foreign religions, though these were usually politically motivated rather than expressions of genuine theological hostility. The Lushan rebellion, which nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty in the 750s, was led by a general of Central Asian descent, and in its aftermath, suspicion of foreigners increased significantly. Women's lives in Chang'an present another contradiction. Tang dynasty women enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in later Chinese dynasties. They could own property, manage businesses, divorce their husbands, and participate in public life in ways that would become impossible under the Song and Ming. Some women achieved genuine fame as poets and courtesans, and even as officials in the imperial bureaucracy. Yet the vast majority of women in Chang'an lived constrained lives, their options limited by class and custom, and the fundamental patriarchy that structured Tang society. The celebrated freedom of Tang women was largely the freedom of aristocratic women, while peasant and working-class women laboured in conditions only marginally better than slavery. The poetry also glosses over the political violence that periodically convulsed the capital. The Tang dynasty began with a purge, when Li Shimin, the brilliant general who would become Emperor Taizong, murdered his brothers and forced his father to abdicate. The imperial palace was the site of multiple coups, assassination attempts and purges throughout the dynasty's history. The Empress Wu Zetian, China's only officially recognized female emperor, rose to power through a combination of political genius and ruthless elimination of rivals. The streets that poets described as peaceful and orderly sometimes ran with blood when factions competed for power. Yet, and this is crucial, the contradiction between poetry and reality does not mean the poetry was simply false. Chang'an really was extraordinary, really did achieve moments of genuine beauty and cosmopolitan harmony, really did produce art and literature and ideas that changed the world. The city contained multitudes, beauty and squalor, tolerance and prejudice, freedom and oppression, all existing simultaneously. The poets were not lying. They were selecting, choosing to emphasize what they found most valuable and worthy of preservation. Their selective vision should not blind us to the city's genuine achievements, but neither should it prevent us from seeing the full reality of life in the world's largest city, with all its complexity and contradiction. Three competing theories dominate modern scholarship about why Chang'an achieved such extraordinary greatness during the Tang dynasty, and each reflects fundamentally different assumptions about what drives historical change. The economic determinists argue that Chang'an's success was primarily a function of infrastructure and geography. The Grand Canal, completed by the Sui dynasty at tremendous human cost, created for the first time in Chinese history a reliable system for moving bulk goods from the wealthy south to the political north. This solved what historians call the capital dilemma of pre-modern China, where the best defensive position for the capital lay in the north, near the frontier with nomadic peoples, but the most productive agricultural regions lay in the south, in the Yangtze Valley. Previous dynasties had struggled with this mismatch, their northern capitals chronically undersupplied and vulnerable to famine. The Tang dynasty inherited the canal system and used it brilliantly. Grain flowed north in a steady stream, allowing Chang'an to support a population far beyond what local agriculture could sustain. This economic foundation, the determinists argue, made everything else possible. A well-fed city is a creative city. Surplus wealth generated by controlling trade along the Silk Road funded the construction of temples and palaces and gardens. The ability to feed 1 million people attracted talent from across Asia, creating a concentration of human capital that generated innovation in art, science, and administration. According to this view, culture and tolerance and cosmopolitanism were secondary effects, downstream consequences of economic success. The Tang dynasty was tolerant of foreigners because foreign merchants made the empire wealthy. Buddhism flourished because monasteries accumulated tax-exempt land and became economic powerhouses. Poetry and art thrived because aristocratic families had surplus wealth to spend on patronage. Strip away the economic foundation, the determinists argue, and the whole magnificent edifice of Tang culture collapses, as indeed it eventually did when the empire's finances imploded in the late 8th century. The cultural historians push back hard against this reductionist view. They point to the unique intellectual synthesis achieved during the early Tang dynasty, when Confucian ethics, Buddhist spirituality, and Taoist philosophy coexisted in creative tension rather than destructive conflict. This synthesis, they argue, created a cultural environment exceptionally open to new ideas and foreign influences. Emperor Taizong, the dynasty's founding genius, deliberately cultivated this openness, encouraging religious debate, patronizing foreign monks, and insisting that his officials study diverse philosophical traditions. The cultural historians trace the roots of Tang cosmopolitanism to specific political choices, not automatic economic forces. When Taizong conquered Central Asia, he faced a choice about how to govern newly acquired territories. He could have imposed direct Chinese administration, forcing local elites to adopt Chinese language and customs. Instead, he created a flexible system that allowed considerable local autonomy, incorporated foreign aristocrats into Tang nobility, and encouraged intermarriage between Chinese and non-Chinese elites. His own family had nomadic ancestors, and he understood that cultural mixture could be a source of strength rather than weakness. This approach, the cultural historians argue, created a positive feedback loop. Tolerance attracted foreign talent, which enriched Tang culture, which made the empire more confident and open, which attracted more foreign talent. The economic benefits followed from cultural choices, not the reverse. Chang'an became a magnet for artists, monks, scholars, and merchants precisely because it was a place where difference was celebrated rather than suppressed. where a Persian Zoroastrian and a Chinese Confucian could debate philosophy without fear, where a Korean student could rise through the examination system to high office. The third major school of thought, led primarily by historians trained in sociology and political science, emphasizes institutional factors. What made Chang'an work, they argue, was neither economics nor culture alone, but the specific administrative structures developed by the Tang Dynasty to govern a vast, diverse empire. The ward system, which divided the city into semi-autonomous neighborhoods, allowed for local self-governance while maintaining overall imperial control. Each ward had its own administration, markets, temples, and social hierarchy, functioning almost as a small town within the larger city. This institutional flexibility, the sociologists argue, was crucial. It allowed different ethnic and religious communities to maintain their identities while participating in the larger Chinese world. The Persian fire worshippers could govern their own affairs within their ward. The Korean community could maintain its language and customs. The Buddhist monasteries could operate as quasi-independent institutions, yet all were ultimately subject to Tang law and administration, preventing the kind of balkanization that destroyed other diverse empires. The Tang examination system also receives attention from institutional historians. By recruiting officials based on demonstrated literary ability rather than purely on birth, the system created opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds to enter the bureaucracy. This meritocratic element, though never as pure in practice as in theory, helped prevent the ossification that plagued other pre-modern administrations. It also created a shared cultural identity among officials, who had all mastered the same classical texts and passed the same examinations, providing cohesion across an otherwise diverse empire. The debate among these schools is not purely academic. Each theory carries implications for modern questions about how diverse societies can maintain unity without resorting to oppression, how economic development relates to cultural flourishing, and whether institutional design can overcome deeper conflicts of interest and identity. The economic determinists tend toward pessimism, suggesting that cosmopolitan harmony is a luxury affordable only in times of prosperity. The cultural historians are more optimistic, believing that values and ideas can shape material reality. The institutionalists split the difference, arguing that good design can mitigate but never entirely overcome economic and cultural tensions. Most contemporary historians agree that all three factors, economics, culture, and institutions, played crucial roles in Chang'an's success, and that trying to isolate a single cause is probably futile. The city's greatness emerged from a complex interaction of favourable conditions, wise leadership, fortunate timing, and the accumulated efforts of millions of ordinary people making daily choices about cooperation and tolerance. The fascinating question is not which factor was most important, but how they reinforced each other in ways that created something unprecedented in human history. The detective work of reconstructing daily life in Tang Dynasty Chang'an requires historians to become amateur archaeologists, linguists, art historians, and even forensic scientists, piecing together evidence from a dozen different sources to understand how 1 million people actually lived 13 centuries ago. The most vivid evidence comes from an unexpected source, the Dunhuang manuscripts, a cache of documents discovered in 1900 in a sealed cave along the Silk Road. Among thousands of Buddhist texts, scholars found mundane documents that had been used as scrap paper by the monks who sealed the cave, letters, contracts, shopping lists, school exercises, medical prescriptions, and official reports. These fragments provide intimate glimpses of ordinary life that official histories never recorded. One letter from a merchant in Chang'an to his partner in Dunhuang complains about the price of rent in the capital's market district. Another document lists the daily expenses of a middle-class household, showing that rice and vegetables were relatively cheap, but meat and wine consumed a significant portion of the family budget. Tang Dynasty poetry, while often idealized, also contains valuable information when read carefully. The great poet Du Fu wrote extensively about Chang'an during the city's golden age and its later troubles, and his verses describe specific streets, markets, and neighborhoods, with enough detail that archaeologists can sometimes identify their locations. Bai Juyi, another master poet, wrote about the lives of common people with unusual sympathy, depicting singing girls, soldiers, farmers, and merchants in ways that reveal their daily struggles and small joys. By cross-referencing poetic descriptions with archaeological evidence and administrative records, historians can verify which details are accurate and which are artistic license. Foreign accounts provide crucial outside perspectives. Arab travelers who visited Chang'an during the 8th century left descriptions in Arabic that corroborate Chinese sources, while adding details Chinese writers took for granted. One Arab merchant writes about his surprise at seeing women walking freely in Chang'an's markets, noting that Tang women did not veil their faces and sometimes even conducted business independently. This seemed remarkable to someone from the Islamic world, where gender segregation was becoming increasingly strict. Another Arab visitor describes the paper money used in Chang'an for large transactions, a financial innovation that would not reach the Islamic world for centuries. Archaeological excavations continue to yield surprises. In 2012, workers digging a subway line in Xi'an uncovered a Tang Dynasty tavern, complete with storage jars, cups, and even residue that chemical analysis identified as wine made from grapes rather than rice. The tavern was located in what Tang maps show was a neighbourhood popular with foreign merchants, and the grape wine suggests it catered specifically to Persian and Central Asian customers who preferred their traditional drink. The building's layout, reconstructed from foundation stones, shows a large common room where customers gathered and smaller private rooms upstairs, probably used for exclusive parties or business negotiations. Tomb excavations provide another crucial source of information. Tang aristocrats were buried with elaborate grave goods intended to sustain them in the afterlife, including ceramic figurines depicting servants, musicians, dancers, merchants, and animals. These tomb figurines, or mingqi, were mass-produced in workshops but still show remarkable detail and variety. Some depict foreigners with distinctive facial features, clothing, and hairstyles that allow researchers to identify their ethnic origins. Central Asian merchants wear long robes and pointed hats, Arab traders wear turbans, Korean officials wear formal court dress, adapted from Chinese styles but with subtle differences. The figurines also depict women in various activities, riding horses, playing polo, dancing, and managing households. These images, combined with legal texts and historical records, have forced historians to revise earlier assumptions about Tang women's lives. While certainly not equal to men by modern standards, Tang women enjoyed freedoms that would be systematically restricted in later Chinese dynasties. Aristocratic women could own and manage property independently. Divorce was possible and not particularly stigmatized. Women could remarry after widowhood without the intense social pressure that later periods imposed. Some women achieved fame as poets, though they were always a small minority in a male-dominated literary world. One particularly revealing investigation involved analysing the remains of Chang'an's waste management system. Tang engineers built an elaborate network of drainage channels and sewers, some large enough for workers to walk through for maintenance. Archaeologists exploring these channels found layers of sediment that, when analysed, revealed what people ate, what materials they used, and even what diseases afflicted them. Parasite eggs in ancient sewage show that intestinal worms were common, as in most pre-modern cities, but the variety of food remains indicates a remarkably diverse diet, at least for those who could afford it. Chemical analysis of soil samples from different wards reveals patterns of pollution and land use. The wards near the palace show higher concentrations of lead and copper, probably from the manufacture of luxury goods and official documents written on metal. The market wards show evidence of organic waste from butchering animals and processing food. The poorest wards show the highest concentrations of pollutants, suggesting that noxious industries like tanning and metalworking were pushed into neighbourhoods where residents lacked political power to resist. Historical demographers have attempted to estimate Chang'an's population by analysing Tang administrative records, which meticulously tracked households for tax purposes. The records are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, but by cross-referencing multiple sources and accounting for likely underreporting of the poor and transients, scholars estimate the peak population at somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million, making Chang'an larger than any other city in the world during the 8th century. The population was not static. People constantly arrived from the countryside and foreign lands while others left or died, creating a dynamic flow that kept the city young and changing. One of the most ambitious recent investigations combined archaeology, climate science, and economic history to understand how Chang'an's food supply actually worked. Researchers analysed pollen in lake sediments near the city to reconstruct agricultural patterns, studied tree rings to identify years of good and bad harvests, examined canal systems to understand transportation logistics, and analysed grain prices recorded in historical documents. The conclusion was sobering. Chang'an operated very close to the edge of sustainability, with the food supply adequate in good years but vulnerable to disruption from drought, canal failures, or political instability. When the Lushan rebellion cut the city off from southern grain supplies in the mid-700s, famine struck almost immediately, and the population plummeted by perhaps half. The investigation continues, each generation of historians bringing new tools and asking new questions. DNA analysis of human remains promises to reveal patterns of migration and intermarriage. Advanced imaging technology allows researchers to read texts on fragile documents without physically touching them. Computer modelling helps reconstruct the flow of people and goods through the city streets. Each new technique adds another piece to the puzzle, bringing us closer to understanding what it really meant to live in Tang Dynasty Chang'an, to wake each morning in the world's largest city and navigate its crowded streets, its complex social hierarchies, its mix of danger and opportunity. In the storage rooms of the Shanxi History Museum in modern Xi'an, thousands of artifacts wait in careful climate control, each one a fragment of Tang Dynasty Chang'an preserved through accident or intention across 13 centuries. Together, they form a material archive of daily life more eloquent than any written history. Consider a single ceramic bowl, unremarkable at first glance, discovered in the remains of a modest house in what was once the city's eastern district. The bowl is porcelain, that peculiarly Chinese invention that Europeans would not master until the 18th century, its glaze still gleaming faintly after more than 1,000 years in the earth. Chemical analysis reveals that it was manufactured in kilns hundreds of miles south of Chang'an in Zhejiang province, then transported north along the Grand Canal. The bowl's presence in a middle-class household demonstrates that luxury goods reached far down the social ladder in Tang China, that even families of modest means could afford items that in Europe would have graced only noble tables. The bowl is decorated with a simple floral pattern, but the flowers are not native to China. They are pomegranates, originally from Persia, introduced to China centuries earlier, but during the Tang Dynasty becoming a popular decorative motif symbolizing fertility and prosperity. This single bowl thus embodies 3 continents, Central Asian fruit depicted on Chinese porcelain, by craftsmen who probably never saw a pomegranate tree but knew them from paintings and descriptions brought by Silk Road travellers. More dramatic evidence comes from a Tang Dynasty trash pit discovered during construction work in 1998. The pit, about 10 feet deep and 15 feet across, was apparently used to dispose of broken or damaged goods from a nearby merchant's warehouse. Archaeologists spent months carefully excavating and cataloguing its contents, finding fragments of silk from China, wool from Central Asia, cotton from India, glass beads from Syria, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Southeast Asia, and jade from what is now Xinjiang. The variety is staggering, proof that Chang'an's markets really did connect Europe to East Asia, that goods crossed thousands of miles through dozens of transactions to end up in the Tang capital's warehouses. One particularly poignant discovery comes from a letter written on paper, found preserved in a sealed jar that somehow survived intact. The letter is from a young man named Wang, who had travelled from his home village to seek employment in Chang'an. He writes to his mother describing his first impressions of the capital, the overwhelming crowds, the incredible variety of people and languages, his fear and excitement at being so far from home. He mentions sleeping in a dormitory with 20 other migrants, working as a porter in the West Market, saving money to eventually bring his family to the city. The letter ends with reassurances that he is eating well and staying safe, the timeless words of a young person trying to comfort worried parents far away. Historians do not know what happened to Wang. His name appears in no other records, and he almost certainly died in obscurity, one of thousands of migrants whose individual stories vanished into the vast anonymity of urban life. But his letter survives, a voice from the past speaking directly across the centuries, reminding us that the great events and famous figures of history unfolded against a background of ordinary people pursuing ordinary dreams, seeking work, missing home, hoping for better lives. The evidence of religious diversity appears in dozens of stone tablets and inscriptions discovered throughout the city's ruins. Most famous is the Nestorian stele, erected in 781 to commemorate the arrival of Christian missionaries in China during the early Tang Dynasty. The stele, which still exists, is inscribed in both Chinese and Syriac, describing how Christianity reached Chang'an and received imperial protection. The Chinese text refers to the religion as Jingjiao, the luminous teaching, and describes Christian doctrines in terms that blend biblical theology with Buddhist and Taoist concepts, an early example of the cultural translation required when ideas cross civilizational boundaries. Other inscriptions mark the locations of Zoroastrian fire temples, Jewish synagogues, and Manichaean churches, though the buildings themselves have long since vanished. The variety of religions practiced openly in Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty's Golden Age was extraordinary by medieval standards, comparable only to a few other cosmopolitan centres like Cordoba in Islamic Spain or Baghdad before the Mongol conquest. The evidence suggests genuine tolerance rather than mere indifference, with the imperial government actively protecting minority religious communities and even providing financial support for temple construction. Coins tell their own story about Chang'an's international connections. The standard Tang copper coin, round with a square hole in the centre, was minted in vast quantities and used throughout East Asia. But excavations in Chang'an have also uncovered Byzantine gold coins, Sasanian Persian silver coins, Arab dinars, and even a few rare Roman coins that somehow survived for centuries before being lost in the Tang capital's streets. These foreign coins were probably not used for everyday transactions, but served as precious metal reserves or curiosities collected by wealthy merchants who had travelled far from home. The evidence of everyday violence appears in skeletal remains showing signs of trauma, healed broken bones, and in one case an arrowhead still embedded in a vertebra. Chang'an was not the peaceful paradise of poetic imagination, but a real city where people fought and sometimes killed each other over money, love, insult, or simple proximity in crowded conditions. Legal documents describe murders, assaults, robberies, and fraud, the eternal crimes of urban life. Yet the overall level of violence seems to have been relatively low, at least during the dynasty's prosperous decades, suggesting that Tang law enforcement was reasonably effective. Perhaps the most moving evidence comes from children's toys found in various locations, small clay animals, wooden swords, rag dolls, and gaming pieces. These humble objects remind us that even in a city of 1 million people, dealing with empire and trade and high politics, children still played, still imagined, still lived lives centered on games and friends and small adventures in their neighborhood streets. The toys are mostly simple, handmade objects that any parent might fashion for a child, though a few elaborate examples from wealthy households show that even in the Tang dynasty, some parents indulge their children with expensive gifts. Every artifact in the museum storage rooms tells multiple stories. The story of its creation, its use, its loss, its recovery, and its interpretation by modern scholars trying to understand a vanished world. Together, these fragments form a mosaic that will never be complete, but becomes richer and more detailed with each new discovery, each careful analysis, each thoughtful interpretation. The evidence does not speak for itself, but requires patient interrogation, and it rewards that patience with glimpses of truth about how people actually lived in the world's largest city 13 centuries ago. Beneath the surface of Chang'an's cosmopolitan splendour lies a truth that official Tang histories deliberately obscured. The empire's capital was not simply tolerant of foreigners, it was fundamentally dependent on them in ways that challenged traditional Chinese assumptions about cultural superiority and the centrality of Han civilization. The deeper investigation begins with a simple question that leads to uncomfortable answers. Who actually ran the Silk Road trade that made Chang'an wealthy? Chinese merchants participated, certainly, but the evidence increasingly shows that the long-distance trade networks connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and beyond were dominated by Sogdian merchants, people from the region around Samarkand who specialized in cross-cultural commerce. The Sogdians spoke an Iranian language, practiced Zoroastrianism or Buddhism, and maintained trading colonies from Xi'an to Constantinople. They were the middlemen of Eurasia, the essential connectors without whom the Silk Road would have been merely a geographic expression rather than a functioning trade network. Tang sources mention Sogdian merchants, but usually in passing, as minor characters in a story centered on Chinese civilization. But archaeological evidence tells a different tale. Sogdian script appears throughout Chang'an's ruins, on tomb inscriptions, commercial documents, and religious texts. Sogdian communities occupied entire wards in the capital, maintaining their language and customs across generations. Some Sogdian families became phenomenally wealthy and politically influential, marrying into Chinese aristocracy and receiving noble titles. The Lushan rebellion, which nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty, was led by a general of Sogdian and Turkish descent, a fact that reveals both how integrated foreigners could become in Tang service and how fragile that integration ultimately proved. The role of foreign military power in Tang success presents another dimension of the deeper mystery. The Tang dynasty conquered Central Asia with armies that were only partly Chinese. Nomadic tribes from the northern steppes, recently defeated and incorporated into the empire, provided much of the cavalry that made Tang military expansion possible. Turkic generals commanded Tang armies. Tibetan soldiers garrisoned Tang frontiers. The empire's military strength depended on its ability to recruit and deploy non-Han warriors who brought different tactical traditions and technologies. This reliance on foreign military power created a paradox at the heart of Tang identity. The dynasty presented itself as the culmination of Chinese civilization, the inheritor of Confucian wisdom and ritual propriety. Yet its armies looked more like multinational forces than traditional Chinese peasant levies. Its generals often spoke Chinese as a second language. Its military culture borrowed extensively from nomadic traditions of horsemanship and archery. The contradiction was manageable as long as the empire remained strong and victories continued. But it became a fault line of catastrophic significance when military governors of foreign descent realized they commanded forces that could challenge the emperor himself. The religious landscape of Chang'an reveals another layer of complexity. Buddhism, introduced from India centuries before the Tang dynasty, had by the 8th century become so deeply embedded in Chinese culture that many people forgot it was originally a foreign religion. Monasteries owned vast estates. Buddhist clergy numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The religion influenced art, literature, philosophy, and daily practice across all social classes. Yet Buddhism's success in China required substantial adaptation. Chinese Buddhism incorporated Confucian ethics and Taoist concepts, creating distinctive schools of thought that Indian Buddhists would have found strange. The Tang dynasty's attitude toward Buddhism oscillated between patronage and persecution, revealing deep anxieties about cultural authenticity and foreign influence. Emperor Xuanzong, who reigned during the dynasty's golden age in the early 700s, initially supported Buddhism but later turned against it, concerned that monasteries accumulated too much wealth and attracted too many men who should have been farming or serving in the army. The great anti-Buddhist persecution of 845, though it occurred after Chang'an's peak, destroyed thousands of monasteries and forced hundreds of thousands of monks to return to secular life, demonstrating that cosmopolitan tolerance had limits when powerful interests felt threatened. Women's roles in Tang Chang'an present perhaps the most fascinating aspect of what official sources never quite acknowledged. The most powerful person in the empire for 15 years was Empress Wu Zetian, who ruled first as regent for her sons and then as emperor in her own right, from 690 to 705. She was the only woman in Chinese history to take the title of emperor rather than empress, and her reign was marked by both effective administration and ruthless elimination of rivals. Official histories, written by Confucian scholars after her death, portrayed her as a usurper who violated natural order. But the deeper mystery is how she came to power at all in a patriarchal society, and what her success reveals about Tang society's capacity for pragmatic flexibility when ideology clashed with political reality. Beneath the Empress Wu's exceptional story lies evidence of broader female agency. Tang women from aristocratic families managed estates, arranged marriages for their children, and sometimes wielded considerable political influence behind the scenes. Female poets, though rare, were celebrated rather than condemned. Courtesans in Chang'an could achieve wealth and cultural prestige through their artistic talents and social connections. The Tang legal code gave women more property rights than later dynasties would permit. None of this made Tang China a gender-equal society, but it suggests that the reality was more complicated than the Confucian ideal of female subordination suggested. The ultimate deeper mystery is why the Tang dynasty chose cosmopolitanism despite the risks it entailed. Opening Chang'an to the world brought wealth, talent, and cultural vitality, but it also created dependencies, vulnerabilities, and identity anxieties. The foreign merchants who made the city prosperous could also manipulate markets and evade taxes. The foreign generals who won battles could also rebel. The foreign religions that attracted devotees could also challenge Confucian orthodoxy. A rational calculation might have suggested that isolation was safer than openness, that cultural purity was more stable than cosmopolitan mixture. Yet for more than a century, the Tang dynasty chose openness, and the choice made Chang'an extraordinary. The deeper truth that official histories obscure is that this choice was never inevitable, never guaranteed, never simply the natural result of Chinese greatness. It was a political decision renewed with each generation, a bet that the benefits of cosmopolitanism outweighed the risks, a wager that ultimately failed when the Lushan rebellion shattered confidence and triggered a long retreat toward conservative nationalism. Understanding this deeper truth transforms how we see Tang dynasty Chang'an, not as paradise but as an achievement, fragile and contested, briefly successful against difficult odds. The year 712 marks the pivot point when Chang'an transforms from merely impressive to genuinely extraordinary, and the transformation centers on one person, Emperor Xuanzong, who ascends to the throne after a coup against his aunt, and proceeds to preside over what historians call the High Tang, the golden age when everything seems possible and the city reaches its absolute peak of wealth, power, and cultural brilliance. Xuanzong is 27 years old when he becomes emperor, young but not inexperienced, having navigated the dangerous politics of the palace for years. He's intelligent, cultured, and ambitious, and he inherits an empire that is already strong, but has not yet realized its full potential. The frontier wars in Central Asia have been largely successful, bringing the Silk Road under Tang control and opening trade routes that stretch from Korea to Persia. The Grand Canal functions efficiently, moving grain north to feed the capital. The bureaucracy, reformed by previous emperors, operates with reasonable competence. The foundation for greatness exists, waiting for someone to build upon it. Xuanzong proves to be that builder, at least for the first 3 decades of his reign. He surrounds himself with capable ministers, men like Yao Chong and Song Jing, who understand that good government requires both grand vision and attention to mundane detail. Together they reform the tax system, reducing the burden on peasants while increasing revenue by bringing more land under cultivation. They improve military administration, ensuring that soldiers are paid regularly and that supplies reach frontier garrisons. They crack down on corruption, executing several high officials pour encourager les autres, and the message gets through that the new emperor will not tolerate the kind of graft that had enriched officials while impoverishing the state. The results appear within a few years. Tax revenues increase dramatically. The population grows as internal peace encourages farming families to have more children. Trade expands as merchants gain confidence that the roads are safe and contracts will be enforced. Chang'an benefits disproportionately from this prosperity, becoming a magnet for talent and wealth from across the empire and beyond. The city's population, probably around 600,000 when Xuanzong takes power, grows to perhaps 1 million by the 730s, making it by far the largest city in the world. The emperor himself becomes intimately associated with Chang'an's cultural flowering. Xuanzong is a musician and composer, and he establishes the Pear Garden, a music academy in the palace that trains hundreds of performers in both Chinese and foreign musical styles. He patronizes poets, inviting them to imperial banquets and rewarding good verses with gold and official appointments. The greatest poets of the age, Li Bai and Du Fu, both spend time in Chang'an during Xuanzong's reign, though neither achieves the kind of lasting official success they hoped for. Li Bai in particular becomes a fixture in Chang'an's wine shops, writing poems of startling beauty while drinking with friends and dreaming of Taoist immortality. The arts flourish under Xuanzong's patronage in ways that transform Chinese culture permanently. Painting reaches new heights of sophistication, with artists developing techniques for depicting landscapes and figures that future generations will study and imitate. Calligraphy, always important in Chinese culture, becomes even more refined, with masters developing distinctive personal styles that connoisseurs can identify at a glance. Ceramics achieve a level of technical and aesthetic perfection that makes Tang pottery treasured across Asia and eventually, centuries later, avidly collected by European aristocrats. The turning point is not merely about art and culture, though those are its most enduring legacies. Xuanzong's reign also marks the peak of Tang military power. The empire's armies campaigned successfully in Central Asia, defeating Tibetan forces and establishing Chinese influence as far west as the approaches to Persia. These victories bring prestige and tribute, with foreign kings sending embassies to Chang'an to acknowledge Tang supremacy. The emperor holds court in splendor, receiving envoys from Korea, Japan, India, Persia, and Arabia, all seeking trade agreements or military alliances, or simply hoping to bask in the reflected glory of the world's most powerful ruler. But the turning point contains within it the seeds of catastrophe, though no one sees it clearly at the time. Xuanzong's passion for music and beauty leads him, in his 60s, to fall deeply in love with Yang Gufei, one of his son's consorts, whom he takes for himself in a scandal that shocks the court. Yang Gufei is beautiful, cultured, and ambitious, and she quickly gains extraordinary influence over the aging emperor. Her relatives receive high positions for which they are unqualified. Corruption returns to the court after decades of relative honesty. The emperor, besotted, spends less time on governance and more time composing music for his beloved. Military policy during this period makes a fateful error. To free Chinese soldiers from frontier duty, the emperor relies increasingly on foreign generals who command non-Chinese troops. This is not new. The Tang dynasty has always used nomadic allies and mercenaries, but the scale increases dramatically under Xuanzong, and power becomes concentrated in the hands of a few military governors who control large armies and vast territories with minimal oversight from the central government. These governors are supposed to be servants of the empire, but the temptation to become independent rulers grows stronger each year they spend far from Chang'an, far from the emperor's direct authority. One governor in particular, Lushan, becomes dangerous. He's of mixed Sogdian and Turkish descent, a gifted general who has won victories against nomadic tribes on the northern frontier. Xuanzong favours him, amused by his rough manners and impressed by his military skill. Yang Guifei adopts Lushan symbolically as her son, though he's only a few years younger than she is, and he becomes a regular visitor to the palace, playing the buffoon but watching everything carefully. He commands the most powerful army in the empire, controls 3 military provinces, and possesses the confidence of a man who knows he could take the throne if he chose to act. In 755, Lushan makes his choice. He rebels, claiming that he is liberating the emperor from evil ministers, though everyone understands that he is attempting to seize power for himself. His armies are battle-hardened and loyal to him personally, while the emperor's forces in Chang'an are parade-ground soldiers who have never seen real combat. The rebels advance rapidly toward the capital, and panic seizes the city. The turning point that brought such glory to Chang'an now becomes the precipice from which everything will fall. The Golden Age, it turns out, lasted exactly one man's lifetime, and that lifetime is ending in fire and blood, and the desperate flight of an old emperor who finally understands that beauty and power are not the same thing, and that the cosmopolitan city he helped create contains within it forces he can no longer control. The Lushan rebellion strikes Chang'an like an earthquake, and when the shaking stops, nothing will ever be the same. Lushan's armies reach the outskirts of the capital in 756, moving with terrifying speed across the North China Plain, brushing aside the emperor's hastily assembled defense forces. Inside Chang'an, panic spreads through the wards as rumors race ahead of the rebel advance. The wealthy begin packing their valuables, preparing to flee south. Foreign merchants abandon their warehouses, leaving goods they spent years accumulating. Buddhist monasteries that had seemed eternal fortresses of faith suddenly appear vulnerable, their monks debating whether to stay and face whatever comes, or join the exodus of refugees streaming toward the gates. Emperor Xuanzong, now 70 years old, finally grasped the magnitude of his miscalculation. The man he trusted, the general he promoted, the buffoon he laughed with at palace banquets, commands an army larger and more loyal than any force the emperor can summon. The regular Tang armies are scattered across the frontier, far from the capital, and the garrison troops in Chang'an are insufficient and unreliable. Ministers present the emperor with an unbearable truth. The city cannot be defended, and if he remains, he will either die or become a puppet ruler, legitimizing the rebel regime. On a summer night in 756, the emperor and his court flee Chang'an in secret, slipping out through a side gate while most of the city sleeps. The imperial procession moves west towards Sichuan, where loyalist forces might offer protection, but the flight quickly becomes a nightmare. The emperor's bodyguard, unpaid and resentful, mutinies at a place called Maowei Slope, 40 miles from the capital. The soldiers blame Yang Guifei and her relatives for the crisis, and they demand her death as the price for continuing to protect the emperor. Xuanzong, the man who commanded millions and received tribute from across Asia, stands powerless as his guards strangle the woman he loved more than his empire. Her body is buried in a hasty grave beside the road. The emperor continues his flight, a broken man who will never return to Chang'an, who will abdicate within months to his son, who will spend his remaining years in comfortable captivity, composing melancholy music about lost love and vanished glory. The turning point has turned completely, and the High Tang ends not with a whimper, but with an emperor weeping beside a road, while smoke rises from his burning capital. And Lushan enters Chang'an and declares himself emperor of a new dynasty, but his triumph is brief and hollow. He is a brilliant general but a terrible administrator, and within months his new regime begins to fracture. His own son, fearing his father's paranoid rage, murders him in 757, but the rebellion continues under new leadership, metastasizing from a coup attempt into a general collapse of order across northern China. The war will last 8 years and kill millions, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Entire provinces are depopulated, cities are sacked and burned. The Grand Canal, that engineering marvel that made Chang'an's prosperity possible, falls into disrepair as warfare disrupts its maintenance. Chang'an itself changes hands multiple times during the rebellion, each occupation bringing fresh looting and destruction. The systematic street grid remains, the walls still stand, but the city's population plummets. Foreign merchants flee and never return. Buddhist monasteries are ransacked for the treasures they accumulated during the prosperous decades. The cosmopolitan wards where Persians and Arabs and Central Asians lived in relative harmony empty out as foreign residents either flee or are killed by mobs seeking scapegoats for the disaster. The city that once welcomed the world retreats into fearful xenophobia. The Tang Dynasty ultimately survives the rebellion, barely. Loyal generals, aided by armies borrowed from the Uyghur nomads to the north, gradually reclaim territory and push the rebels back, and Lushan's successors are defeated or surrender, and by 763 the war is officially over. But the victory is Pyrrhic. To pay the Uyghurs for their military assistance, the Tang court grants them permission to loot Chang'an for 3 days, and the nomadic warriors take full advantage, carrying off silk, gold, and thousands of captives who will be sold into slavery on the Central Asian steppes. The economic consequences reshape the empire permanently. The rebellion destroyed the efficient tax system that had funded Tang greatness, forcing the government to rely increasingly on commercial taxes, salt monopolies, and other revenue sources that bear more heavily on merchants and the urban population. The equal field system, which had distributed land to peasant families in exchange for tax payments and military service, collapses as powerful families seize land and peasants flee to become tenant farmers or urban labourers. The empire's finances never fully recover, and chronic budget crises plague every emperor for the remaining century and a half of Tang rule. The military consequences are equally profound. The professional armies that had made Tang expansion possible are destroyed or dispersed during the rebellion, and they are never fully reconstituted. Instead, the empire comes to rely on military governors who control regional armies and exercise near-independent power over their territories. These governors become a permanent feature of late Tang politics, sometimes loyal to the emperor, sometimes neutral, sometimes openly rebellious. The central government's authority is permanently diminished, and China fragments into what historians call a proto-feudal system, where real power lies not in Chang'an but in the provinces. The psychological consequences are perhaps most important for understanding what happens to Chang'an after the rebellion. The confidence that had made the Tang dynasty cosmopolitan and tolerant vanishes, replaced by suspicion of foreigners and nostalgia for an imagined past of pure Chinese culture. The rebellion had been led by a general of foreign descent, and this fact becomes a lesson learned too well. Foreign merchants face increased restrictions. Foreign religions, especially Buddhism, come under pressure from Confucian scholars who argue that alien beliefs weaken Chinese society. The openness that had made Chang'an extraordinary comes to be seen as a dangerous vulnerability rather than a source of strength. Yet the city does not disappear. Chang'an remains the capital, and the Tang dynasty limps forward for another century and a half. The population gradually recovers, though it never again reaches the peak of Xuanzong's golden age. Markets reopen, though they are smaller and less diverse. Officials still arrive from across the empire to take examinations and seek posts in the bureaucracy. Life continues because life always continues, but something essential has been lost. The spontaneous cosmopolitanism, the confident embrace of the foreign and strange, the sense that Chang'an was not just a Chinese city but the city of the world, all these fade into memory and poetry, becoming stories old people tell about a golden age when anything seemed possible and the future stretched bright and boundless before them. The influence of Tang dynasty Chang'an ripples outward from its moment of glory in ways that reshape Asian civilization and eventually touch the entire world, creating patterns of culture and trade and political organization that endure long after the city itself declines into provincial obscurity. The most immediate and visible impact appears in Japan, where the Nara and Heian periods see wholesale adoption of Tang models in everything from urban planning to political theory to aesthetic standards. The Japanese capital of Heijō-kyo, modern Nara, built in 710, is a deliberate smaller-scale replica of Chang'an, laid out in the same grid pattern, with the same orientation and similar division into wards. When the capital moves to Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, in 794, the new city again follows the Chang'an model, though adapted to Japanese geography and local building traditions. But the borrowing goes far deeper than architecture. The Japanese imperial system, reformed during the 7th and 8th centuries, adopts Tang administrative structures, creating a bureaucracy staffed by officials who have passed examinations testing their knowledge of Confucian classics. The Japanese legal code, the Taiho Code of 701, draws heavily on Tang law. Japanese court dress imitates Tang fashions. Japanese music incorporates Tang instruments and melodies, which survive in Japanese court music called gagaku, long after the original Chinese forms evolved beyond recognition. Even the Japanese writing system, previously limited to Chinese characters used phonetically, develops new cursive forms inspired by Tang calligraphy. The cultural transmission happens through official embassies that Japan sends to China every 10 or 20 years during the 7th and 8th centuries. These embassies are massive undertakings, involving hundreds of people who travel by ship across dangerous seas to reach the Tang capital. Many Japanese envoys drown when storms sink their vessels, but those who reach Chang'an spend months or years in the city, studying everything they can before returning home with books, art objects, and memories of the world's greatest metropolis. Some Japanese students remain in China for decades, becoming fluent in Chinese and achieving success in Tang literary circles before eventually returning to Japan to share what they have learned. Korea's relationship with Tang culture is more complex because Korea has been interacting with Chinese civilization for centuries before the Tang dynasty appears. The Kingdom of Silla, which unifies the Korean peninsula with Tang military assistance in the 7th century, models its capital of Gyeongju on Chang'an while maintaining distinctive Korean elements. Korean aristocrats study Confucian classics and compete in examinations similar to those in China. Korean monks travel to Chang'an to study Buddhism before returning to establish Korean schools of Buddhist thought. Yet Korea never simply copies China, instead adapting Tang models to Korean circumstances and maintaining a cultural identity distinct from its powerful neighbour. The impact on Southeast Asia operates through different channels, primarily Buddhist networks rather than direct political influence. Monks from what are now Thailand, Vietnam and Indonesia travel to Chang'an to study at its great monasteries, then carry home not only religious teachings, but also artistic styles, architectural techniques, and cultural practices. Tang Buddhist sculpture influences temple art across Southeast Asia. Tang ceramic styles are imitated by Vietnamese potters. The ideal of the universal Buddhist monarch, ruling with compassion and supporting the monastic community, shapes how Southeast Asian kings understand and justify their power. Perhaps the most profound impact appears in the realm of ideas rather than institutions. The Tang dynasty at its height demonstrated that a large, diverse empire could be governed through civil administration rather than military force, through merit-based bureaucracy rather than aristocratic privilege, through written law rather than arbitrary power. This model, while never perfectly realized even in Tang China, offered an alternative to the feudal and theocratic systems, that dominated much of the medieval world. The idea that officials should be selected through competitive examinations testing literary skill and moral understanding, rather than through birth or military prowess, was revolutionary, and it shaped East Asian governance for 1,000 years. The examination system, refined during the Tang Dynasty, becomes the defining feature of Chinese civilization and spreads to Korea, Vietnam, and eventually influences civil service reform movements in 19th century Europe, when European intellectuals discover Confucian governance through translations and travellers' accounts. The notion that any talented person, regardless of birth, could theoretically rise through government service to the highest positions creates social mobility that, while limited in practice, still exceeds what most medieval European societies offered. The examination system's emphasis on literary culture also has profound consequences, creating a scholar-official class whose identity centres on poetry, calligraphy, and classical learning rather than military prowess or religious authority. The Silk Road trade networks, reaching their peak during the Tang Dynasty, create economic connections that outlast the empire itself. The routes connecting Chang'an to Central Asia and beyond remain crucial for centuries, carrying not only silk and spices but also technologies, religions, and ideas. Paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, the four great inventions traditionally attributed to China, all spread westward along routes that pass through Chang'an or its successor cities. Islamic scholars study Chinese astronomical texts translated by Central Asian intermediaries. Chinese ceramics inspire Islamic potters to develop new glazing techniques. The cultural exchange flows in both directions, enriching both civilizations. The Tang Dynasty's cosmopolitan ideal, though it ultimately fails to survive the Lushan rebellion, plants seeds that germinate in unexpected places. The notion that civilization need not be narrowly defined, that multiple religious and philosophical traditions can coexist productively, that foreigners can contribute valuable skills and perspectives. All these ideas, demonstrated if imperfectly in Tang Chang'an, offer an alternative to the xenophobic isolation that sometimes dominates pre-modern societies. When Chinese civilization retreats toward cultural conservatism in later dynasties, the memory of Tang cosmopolitanism survives in poetry and history, a reminder of a different possibility. The aesthetic impact of Tang Dynasty art lasts longest and spreads farthest. Tang poetry, especially the works of Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei, set standards that Chinese poets study and imitate for centuries. The Tang poetic forms, especially the regulated verse called Lushi, become the gold standard for literary Chinese. Tang landscape painting influences East Asian art for 1,000 years. Tang Buddhist sculpture, with its serene faces and flowing robes, establishes a visual language for depicting enlightenment that spreads throughout Buddhist Asia. Even Tang fashion, documented in paintings and tomb figurines, continues to influence costume designers and historical dramatists, trying to capture the visual essence of classical Chinese elegance. The ultimate impact of Tang Dynasty Chang'an is less tangible but perhaps most important. The city during its golden age proved that human beings from radically different cultures could live together in relative peace and mutual respect, that diversity could be a source of vitality rather than conflict, that a cosmopolitan city could achieve things that isolated, homogeneous societies could not. This proof was temporary, fragile, dependent on specific conditions that did not last, but it existed. For more than a century, Chang'an showed what was possible, and that example echoes through history, inspiring those who believe that civilization at its best embraces rather than excludes, welcomes rather than rejects, learns from rather than fears the stranger at the gate. Behind the grand narrative of emperors and rebellions and cultural flowering, Chang'an was fundamentally a city of individual human beings, each pursuing private dreams and enduring personal sorrows, their voices mostly lost to history but occasionally preserved in fragments that allow us to imagine what life actually felt like on those crowded streets 13 centuries ago. Consider Zhang, a merchant's son from a prosperous family in the southern city of Yangzhou, who travels to Chang'an in 730 to take the imperial examinations. He's 22 years old, educated in the classics since childhood, confident in his literary ability, and ambitious to enter government service. His father has paid for the journey, a significant investment of family resources, and the expectation is clear. Zhang must pass the examinations, receive an official appointment, and bring honour and connections to his family. The pressure is immense, but so is the opportunity. Success in the examinations can transform a merchant family's social status, opening doors that mere wealth cannot unlock. Zhang arrives in Chang'an in early spring, when willow trees along the canals are just beginning to bud, and he is overwhelmed by the city's scale and energy. He finds lodging in a boarding house near the East Market, sharing a room with 3 other examination candidates from different provinces. They become friends through proximity and shared anxiety, staying up late to practice composing poems in the regulated forms required by the examinations, critiquing each other's work with the brutal honesty of young men who understand that only a small percentage of candidates will pass. The examination process is rigorous and impersonal. Candidates gather before dawn at the examination grounds, a special compound near the palace where thousands of men compete over several days in writing essays and poems on assigned topics. The candidates' names are concealed to prevent favoritism, their papers identified only by numbers. Graders, senior officials selected for their literary expertise, read each composition carefully, looking for evidence of deep classical learning, elegant prose style and original insight. Most candidates fail, their papers returned with terse notations of inadequacy. Those who fail once usually try again the following year, and some men attempt the examinations 5 or 10 times before finally passing or giving up. Zhang passes on his first attempt, one of perhaps 300 successful candidates out of several thousand who competed that year. The announcement of results is a moment of pure joy, and he celebrates with his roommates, those who passed and those who did not, drinking wine late into the night and composing drunken poems about friendship and ambition and the strange turns of fate. He receives a minor appointment in the Imperial Archives, a low-level position, but an entry point into the bureaucracy. His father, receiving the news in Yangzhou, weeps with pride and immediately begins planning how to leverage his son's success into business advantages. Now consider Parviz, a Sogdian merchant who arrived in Chang'an in 715. Fleeing the Arab conquest of his homeland in Central Asia. He is 30 years old, speaks minimal Chinese, and has nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bag of silver coins sewn into his belt. The Sogdians have a network in Chang'an, a community of earlier migrants who help newcomers find housing and employment, and Parviz connects with distant relatives who run a trading company dealing in silk and spices. He works for them initially as a porter and translator, learning Chinese quickly because his survival depends on it. Within 10 years, Parviz has established his own small trading business, partnering with Chinese merchants who handle the local side of transactions while he manages contacts with Central Asian suppliers. He marries a Chinese woman from a modest family, a widow with a young daughter who needs a husband and is willing to marry a foreigner. The marriage is practical rather than romantic, at least at first, but over time they develop genuine affection. They have 3 children together, and Parviz converts nominally to Buddhism while maintaining private devotion to Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian god of his childhood. His children grow up bilingual, equally comfortable in Sogdian and Chinese, belonging fully to neither culture but finding their own hybrid identity. Parviz prospers during the golden age of Xuanzong's reign, accumulating enough wealth to buy property, and eventually achieving the status of a minor notable in Chang'an's foreign community. But the Lushan rebellion destroys everything he built. When the rebels enter the city, gangs attack the foreign wards, and Parviz's warehouse is looted and burned. He escapes with his family to the south, joining the flood of refugees, but his wife dies on the road from illness or exhaustion, or simply giving up. Parviz survives, eventually settles in a southern city, never returns to Chang'an. He dies an old man, sometimes telling his grandchildren stories about the greatest city in the world, though they only half believe him, thinking old people always exaggerate the wonders of their youth. Now consider Lotus, a singing girl who works in a wine shop in the entertainment district near the West Market. She's 18 years old, sold by her impoverished parents when she was 12 to a training house that taught her to sing, dance, play musical instruments, and entertain male customers with conversation and flirtation. She's not technically a prostitute. The wine shop where she works maintains strict boundaries, but those boundaries are negotiable when the price is right. She has no illusions about her situation. She is property, valuable property, because she is beautiful and talented. but still property that can be bought or sold or discarded when age diminishes her appeal. Lotus has regulars, customers who request her specifically when they visit the wine shop, and she knows how to make them feel special without revealing anything real about herself. She performs a role, the charming girl who finds each man fascinating, who laughs at their jokes and admires their poetry, and suggests through subtle cues that perhaps, if circumstances were different, something more than professional friendship might develop between them. Most customers understand the game and appreciate her skill at playing it. A few fall genuinely in love and make offers to purchase her contract, though her owner sets the price high enough that only a wealthy man could afford it. One customer, a minor official named Wang, does buy her contract after a year of courtship, and she becomes his concubine, a significant improvement in status. She bears him a son, which secures her position in his household, though his primary wife resents her and makes life difficult through small cruelties that cannot be openly acknowledged. Lotus survives through the same skills she developed in the wine shop: reading people, managing emotions, knowing when to advance and when to retreat. She teaches her son to read and write, hoping he will pass the examinations and become an official, lifting the family another rung up the social ladder. Whether he succeeds, history does not record. Lotus vanishes from the historical record after her son's birth, one of thousands of women whose lives touched greatness tangentially, but whose own stories were never deemed worth preserving. These three lives, Zhang the examination candidate, Parviz the Sogdian merchant, Lotus the singing girl, represent millions of individual experiences that collectively created the human reality of Tang Dynasty Chang'an. They were not the poets whose verses we still read, or the emperors whose decisions shaped history, but they were equally real, equally fully human, equally deserving of memory even though memory has largely forgotten them. Their joys and sorrows, their small victories and daily struggles, their loves and fears and dreams, all these filled the wards and markets and wine shops of the great city, creating the texture of lived experience that no official history can capture, but that archaeology and poetry and historical imagination can sometimes glimpse. Not everyone in Tang Dynasty Chang'an embraced cosmopolitanism and cultural openness, and the conservative opposition, though ultimately unsuccessful during the dynasty's golden age, left a powerful legacy that shaped China's future in profound ways. The Confucian scholars, guardians of traditional Chinese learning, watched the influx of foreign ideas and foreign people with growing alarm. From their perspective, Chinese civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, perfected over thousands of years through the accumulated wisdom of sages and the refinement of ritual propriety. Foreign cultures might be interesting as curiosities, but they had nothing essential to teach China, and their influence could only corrupt the purity of classical traditions. This view was not mere xenophobia. It was grounded in a sincere belief that China had discovered fundamental truths about social organization, ethical behavior, and cosmic harmony that other cultures had missed. Buddhism particularly troubled the Confucian conservatives. The religion had been in China for centuries by the Tang dynasty's founding, and it had become extraordinarily popular across all social classes. But its fundamental assumptions clashed with Confucian values in ways that could not be reconciled. Buddhism preached that family attachments were obstacles to enlightenment, while Confucianism placed family loyalty at the center of ethical life. Buddhism taught that the ultimate goal was escape from the cycle of rebirth, while Confucianism focused on creating harmony in this world through proper relationships and good government. Buddhism attracted men into monasteries where they produced no children and paid no taxes, while Confucianism valued procreation and saw tax payment as a moral duty. Han Yu, one of the greatest Confucian thinkers of the Tang dynasty, articulated the conservative position in a famous memorial submitted to Emperor Xuanzong in 819. The emperor had ordered that a finger bone of the Buddha, a sacred relic, be brought to the palace for veneration, and Han Yu was outraged. In his memorial, he argued that Buddhism was a barbarian superstition unworthy of Chinese respect, that the Buddha himself had been a foreigner who knew nothing of Chinese civilization, that venerating Buddhist relics was beneath the dignity of a Chinese emperor. The language was harsh and uncompromising, and the emperor was furious, nearly executing Han Yu before commuting the sentence to exile. But Han Yu's arguments resonated with many scholars and officials who felt that Tang cosmopolitanism had gone too far, that in welcoming the world, China was losing itself. These conservatives did not oppose all foreign influence. They recognized that trade was beneficial and that some foreign technologies were useful, but they wanted to maintain clear boundaries between the essential Chinese core and peripheral foreign additions. They believed that Buddhism, with its vast monastic wealth and its claim to spiritual authority independent of the state, represented a genuine threat to Chinese civilization's survival. The conservatives also resented the power of foreign military governors whose armies gave them independence from central control. The Lushan rebellion seemed to prove the conservatives' warnings. A foreign general, given too much trust and too much power, had nearly destroyed the dynasty. After the rebellion, conservative voices grew stronger, arguing that China must return to its roots, must stop indulging foreign influences, must reassert the primacy of Confucian values in government and society. The Tang dynasty's late period saw increasing restrictions on foreign merchants, periodic persecutions of foreign religions, and a general retreat from the openness that had characterized the Golden Age. Religious conservatives, particularly within the Buddhist establishment itself, also resisted certain forms of foreign influence. Chinese Buddhism had developed distinctive schools of thought and practice, and some Chinese monks regarded Indian Buddhism, the religion's place of origin, as too scholastic, too concerned with philosophical debate rather than actual enlightenment. The Chan school, known in Japan as Zen, emerged partly as a Chinese response to what its founders saw as excessive foreign complexity. Chan Buddhism emphasized direct experience over textual study, meditation over ritual, and intuitive understanding over intellectual analysis. It was Buddhism adapted to Chinese sensibilities, simplified and made practical in ways that Indian Buddhists often found troublingly anti-intellectual. Economic conservatives, particularly among established Chinese merchant families, resented the success of Sogdian traders who seemed to dominate long-distance commerce. The Sogdians' competitive advantage came partly from their language skills and international connections, but Chinese merchants portrayed them as unscrupulous foreigners who cheated honest Chinese businessmen through deceptive practices. Whether these accusations reflected reality or simply envy is difficult to determine, but they reveal underlying tensions in Chang'an's supposedly harmonious cosmopolitan economy. Some Chinese merchants petitioned the government for restrictions on foreign traders, arguing that they were draining wealth from China by exporting silk and importing luxury goods that contributed nothing to the empire's strength. Cultural conservatives worried about foreign influence on Chinese music and art. During Xuanzong's reign, foreign musical styles became fashionable at court, and the emperor himself composed pieces incorporating Central Asian instruments and melodies. Conservative critics complained that this foreign music was barbarous noise that corrupted refined Chinese taste. They wanted to preserve traditional Chinese music, with its emphasis on subtle harmonies and restrained expression, against what they saw as the loud, emotional excess of foreign styles. Similar debates occurred about painting and sculpture, with conservatives arguing that foreign artistic influences were leading Chinese artists away from classical standards of proportion and composition. Women's freedom during the Tang dynasty also attracted conservative criticism. Confucian scholars believed that proper society required clear separation between male and female spheres, with women confined to domestic space and subordinated to male authority. Tang women's relative freedom, their ability to own property and manage businesses and appear in public without heavy restrictions, violated these principles. Conservative writers produced treatises on women's proper behavior, emphasizing obedience, modesty, and seclusion. They held up examples of virtuous women from ancient times who had sacrificed everything for family honor, implicitly criticizing Tang women for their independence and worldliness. The opposition ultimately won, though not until after the Tang dynasty fell. The Song dynasty, which reunified China in the 10th century after decades of chaos, adopted many of the conservatives' arguments. Song China was wealthier and in some ways more sophisticated than Tang China, but it was also more inward-looking, more restrictive of women, more suspicious of foreigners, and more orthodox in its Confucianism. The Song dynasty established Neo-Confucianism as official ideology, a reformed version of classical teaching that explicitly rejected Buddhist and Taoist influences. The cosmopolitan openness that had made Chang'an extraordinary came to be seen not as a glorious achievement, but as a dangerous deviation from Chinese tradition, a mistake to be avoided rather than a model to emulate. Within the tension between cosmopolitan openness and conservative tradition, Tang Dynasty Chang'an produced a cultural flowering so extraordinary that its influence echoes through Asian civilization 13 centuries later, a moment when poetry, art, philosophy, and religious thought achieved a synthesis that would never quite be replicated. The awakening begins, paradoxically, in the years immediately following the Lushan rebellion, when the empire is broken and bleeding, and the capital itself has been sacked multiple times. You would expect cultural collapse to follow political catastrophe, but instead something unexpected happens. The poets who lived through the rebellion, who witnessed the destruction of the world they knew, who survived hunger and fear and loss, find in their suffering a depth of expression that the earlier, easier years never quite achieved. Their poetry becomes more personal, more emotionally direct, more concerned with the actual texture of human experience rather than conventional expressions of conventional sentiments. Du Fu, who spent the golden years of Xuanzong's reign unsuccessfully seeking official appointment, finally achieves recognition during and after the rebellion, though recognition brings him little material comfort. He lives in poverty, moves constantly to escape warfare, watches his children die of malnutrition, and through it all writes poetry of searing emotional honesty. His poem, Spring View, captures the moment after Chang'an's fall with devastating simplicity. The state is shattered, but mountains and rivers remain, he writes. Spring comes to the ruined city and grass grows thick. The flowers seem to weep and birds startle his anxious heart. He has been separated from family for months, and news is so rare that a letter would be worth more than gold. This kind of direct emotional expression, anchored in specific moments of personal suffering, transforms Chinese poetry. Earlier, Tang poets wrote beautifully but often conventionally, celebrating friendship and wine and beautiful landscapes in ways that followed established patterns. Du Fu and his generation break the patterns, not through technical innovation, but through absolute sincerity. They use the same poetic forms, the same regulated verse structures, the same classical allusions, but they pour into these forms experiences so immediate and emotions so raw that the conventional structures crack open to reveal something new. The Buddhist awakening during this period takes a different form, but is equally profound. The shock of the rebellion forces Chinese Buddhists to confront questions about suffering and impermanence that had been theoretical during the prosperous decades. If everything can be lost in a moment, if wealth and power and beauty all dissolve like smoke, then what is real? What endures? The Chan school, which had been developing for centuries, suddenly finds a receptive audience among people who have seen their world collapse and are searching for truth that cannot be destroyed by armies or political upheaval. Chan masters develop teaching methods designed to shock students out of conventional thinking. They tell paradoxical stories called koans that frustrate logical analysis and force intuitive understanding. They strike students with sticks during meditation, not out of cruelty, but to jolt them from drowsiness into presence. They insist that enlightenment is not something achieved through years of study, but something recognized instantly when the mind stops grasping and simply sees reality as it is. This approach appeals particularly to educated Chinese, who have been trained in Confucian rationalism and now need to find meaning in a world where rationalism has failed to prevent catastrophe. The visual arts also awakened to new possibilities during the late Tang period. Landscape painting, which had existed before but as a minor genre, suddenly becomes central to Chinese artistic expression. Artists like Wang Wei, who was both a great poet and accomplished painter, developed techniques for depicting mountains and rivers and forests that suggest cosmic principles rather than merely copying nature. The paintings are not realistic in a Western sense. They make no attempt at perspective or anatomical accuracy, but they capture something essential about the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. Looking at a Tang landscape painting, you are meant to feel not that you are viewing a scene, but that you are entering a space, a mental and spiritual space, where ordinary distinctions between self and world dissolve. Calligraphy achieves new status as the supreme art form, the purest expression of an artist's inner cultivation. The great calligraphers of the late Tang period are revered not merely for technical skill, but for the way their brushwork embodies their character. Each stroke reveals the artist's state of mind at the moment of creation, whether calm or agitated, confident or hesitant, joyful or melancholic. Collectors treasure calligraphy by famous artists, not for what the characters say, but for what the physical act of writing reveals about the writer. The art form becomes a kind of meditation in motion, a practice that cultivates presence and spontaneity while producing beautiful objects that others can treasure. Music during this period also awakens to new expressive possibilities, though we know less about Tang music because musical notation was not standardized and actual sounds are lost forever. But literary sources describe the emotional power of Tang musical performance, particularly the pipa, a lute-like instrument introduced from Central Asia that becomes central to Chinese music. Bai Jui writes a famous poem about hearing a pipa player whose music is so moving that listeners weep, and the poet himself feels that the musician understands loneliness and loss in ways that words cannot express. The poem suggests that music, like poetry and painting and calligraphy, has become a vehicle for expressing truths that conventional language cannot capture. The philosophical awakening of late Tang China involves a gradual synthesis of the three great traditions, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, into something that is not quite any of them but draws on all three. Educated people no longer see these traditions as mutually exclusive but as complementary perspectives on human life. You could be Confucian in your public role, fulfilling social duties and serving government with integrity, Buddhist in your spiritual practice, meditating and studying texts that explore consciousness and suffering, Taoist in your private life, cultivating simplicity and spontaneity, and appreciation for natural beauty. This synthesis does not eliminate tensions between the traditions, but it creates space for creative interaction. The awakening also appears in scholarship and historical writing. Tang scholars produce comprehensive histories of earlier periods, collecting and organizing materials that would otherwise have been lost. They compile encyclopedias of knowledge, anthologies of poetry, commentaries on classics, dictionaries of rare characters. This work is not creative in the way that poetry and painting are creative, but it performs an essential function, preserving and organizing China's cultural heritage for future generations. Without the scholarly work done during the Tang Dynasty, much of earlier Chinese literature and philosophy would have disappeared entirely. Perhaps most remarkably, the cultural awakening happens despite political chaos and economic decline, not because of stability and prosperity. The late Tang dynasty limps from crisis to crisis, military governors rebel periodically, the government is chronically broke, the population declines as people flee warfare and famine. Yet somehow, in the spaces between catastrophes, artists and poets and monks and scholars continue their work, continue creating, continue pursuing truth and beauty as if these things matter even when empires fall. And they do matter, because 13 centuries later, we still read Dufu's poems and study Tang painting, and meditate using methods developed by Chan masters who lived through China's darkest decades, and found in that darkness something worth preserving and passing forward through time. The deepest truth about Tang Dynasty Chang'an emerges not from any single fact, but from the pattern that becomes visible when you step back and see the whole arc of its history, from foundation to golden age to catastrophic decline. The revelation is uncomfortable for those who want simple lessons from history, because it suggests that the qualities that make a society great are inseparable from the vulnerabilities that eventually destroy it. Chang'an's extraordinary cosmopolitanism, the openness to foreign people and foreign ideas that made it the most diverse and creative city on earth, was not an accidental benefit of economic prosperity, but a conscious political choice renewed daily by thousands of individual decisions. Emperors chose to protect foreign religions rather than suppress them. Officials chose to allow foreign merchants to settle permanently rather than restricting them to temporary trade. Ordinary Chinese chose to learn from foreign teachers, to marry foreign partners, to adopt foreign customs and foreign gods. None of this was inevitable. Other societies facing similar circumstances chose differently, chose purity over mixture, chose familiar certainty over foreign possibility. But the same openness that brought such richness also created the conditions for disaster, and Lushan, the general who nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty, was himself a product of Tang cosmopolitanism, a man of mixed Sogdian and Turkish descent who rose through the military because the empire valued talent regardless of ethnic origin. His rebellion succeeded initially because he commanded armies of foreign soldiers who were loyal to him personally rather than to the Chinese state. The forces that made the empire strong also made it vulnerable, and there was no way to have the benefits without the risks. The revelation extends to economics. The Grand Canal, that engineering marvel that made Chang'an's enormous population possible, was built through forced labour that killed hundreds of thousands of workers during the Sui dynasty. The prosperity of the Tang dynasty rested on a foundation of earlier suffering, and the canal itself required constant maintenance that imposed heavy burdens on people living along its route. The cosmopolitan trade that enriched Chang'an created dependencies. When the Silk Road was disrupted by warfare or when the canal system failed, the capital quickly faced famine. The city's greatness required a logistical system so complex that it was perpetually on the edge of breakdown. The cultural flowering of the Tang dynasty also reveals an uncomfortable truth about the relationship between suffering and art. The greatest Tang poetry was written not during the peaceful, prosperous decades of the Golden Age, but during and after the Lushan rebellion, when poets had experienced genuine loss and could write about human vulnerability with authority earned through pain. Du Fu's poems about separation and hunger and the heartbreak of watching a beloved city burn are more moving than Li Bai's earlier verses about wine and friendship and Taoist immortality. Not because Du Fu was a better poet in any technical sense, but because he had lived through things that stripped away conventional sentiment and forced him to find language adequate to tragedy. This suggests something troubling about the relationship between comfort and creativity. Too much security, too much prosperity, too much confidence that the good times will continue forever may actually inhibit the kind of profound artistic expression that comes from confronting impermanence and loss. The Golden Age produced beautiful poetry, but the catastrophe produced great poetry, and the difference matters. If this is true, then perhaps human societies face an impossible choice between the kind of stable prosperity we all desire and the kind of cultural intensity that seems to require crisis. The deeper revelation about cosmopolitanism involves recognizing that tolerance is easier when resources are abundant and threats seem distant. Tang Dynasty Chang'an was genuinely more tolerant than most medieval societies, but that tolerance waxed and waned with the empire's fortunes. When times were good and trade was profitable and foreign merchants brought wealth, the city welcomed diversity. When times were bad and people were frightened and looking for scapegoats, foreign communities faced violence and persecution. The cosmopolitan ideal was never secure, never taken for granted, always dependent on conditions that could change quickly. This historical truth speaks to modern debates about diversity and national identity. It would be comforting to believe that cosmopolitanism is simply good and isolation is simply bad, that diverse societies are stronger and more creative than homogeneous ones, in all circumstances and at all times. The Tang dynasty experience suggests a more complex reality. Diversity brings enormous benefits, but it also creates tensions that require constant management and periodic renewal of the commitment to tolerance. The choice for openness must be made again and again, and sometimes, when societies are under stress, the choice goes the other way. The revelation about gender and social hierarchy is equally nuanced. Tang dynasty women enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in later Chinese dynasties, but that freedom was always relative, always constrained, always primarily available to women of the aristocratic class. The singing girls and concubines who added so much colour to Tang literature were not free in any meaningful sense. They were property whose value derived from their ability to please men. The female poets who achieved fame were exceptional individuals whose success did not change the fundamental patriarchy of Tang society. Progress toward genuine equality is not linear, and gains can be lost, as indeed happened when later dynasties reimposed much stricter controls on women's lives. The ultimate revelation about Tang dynasty Chang'an is that historical greatness is fragile, contingent, and temporary. The city was the largest and most sophisticated in the world for perhaps a century, maybe less. Then it declined, its population shrank, its cosmopolitan character faded, and eventually even its location was abandoned when later dynasties chose different capitals. Nothing about the city's greatness was permanent or guaranteed. The grandest palaces crumbled, the widest streets filled with weeds, the most celebrated poets were forgotten for centuries until later scholars rediscovered their work. This impermanence is not a flaw or a failure, but the fundamental condition of all human achievement. Cities rise and fall, empires expand and contract, golden ages end. Recognizing this truth could lead to despair, to the conclusion that nothing matters if nothing lasts, but it can also lead to a different wisdom, an appreciation for beauty precisely because it is temporary, a commitment to creating and preserving and passing forward what we value, even though we know it will not endure forever. The Tang Dynasty poets understood this. They wrote about transience constantly, about falling blossoms and migrating geese and friends parting at river crossings, knowing they would likely never meet again. The deepest truth about Chang'an is that its greatness emerged from choices, not from fate or geography or inevitable historical forces, and that those choices were difficult, risky, and never entirely successful. The people who built the city and made it extraordinary were not wiser or better than people in other times and places, but they made certain choices that we can still learn from, choices about openness over closure, about risk over safety, about building something magnificent even when you know it cannot last forever. That they ultimately failed to sustain what they created does not diminish the achievement. It confirms that the achievement was real, that they genuinely reached for something beyond the ordinary, and that for a brief moment in human history, they succeeded. 13 centuries separate our world from Tang Dynasty Chang'an, and yet the questions the city poses remain stubbornly contemporary. Questions about how diverse societies maintain unity, about the relationship between economic prosperity and cultural flourishing, about the costs and benefits of openness to foreign influence, about whether human beings can build something that transcends narrow tribal identities without eventually falling victim to the tensions that cosmopolitanism inevitably creates. We live in a time of mass migration, when millions of people cross borders seeking opportunity or fleeing danger, when major cities from London to Singapore to Los Angeles are as ethnically diverse as Chang'an ever was. The debates about immigration, about national identity, about the balance between preserving tradition and embracing change, all echo arguments that Tang Dynasty scholars had more than 1,000 years ago. Han Yu, the Confucian conservative who condemned Buddhism as foreign corruption, would recognize the contemporary anxieties about whether too much diversity threatens social cohesion. Emperor Xuanzong, who welcomed foreign merchants and foreign religions and foreign generals until it nearly destroyed his empire, would understand the contemporary debate about whether cosmopolitanism is a strength or a vulnerability. The Tang Dynasty experience does not provide easy answers to these questions, but it does offer a sobering perspective. Cosmopolitanism works, when it works, not automatically, but through sustained political commitment and careful institutional design. The Tang Dynasty's ward system, which allowed different communities to maintain their identities while participating in the larger Chinese world, suggests that diversity requires structure, that simply throwing different groups together and hoping they will get along is not sufficient. The examination system, which created a shared elite culture that transcended ethnic differences, suggests that diverse societies need unifying institutions that command respect across communities. But the Tang Dynasty also demonstrates that even the most carefully designed cosmopolitan system remains vulnerable to crisis. When the empire faced military defeat and economic collapse during the Lushan rebellion, tolerance eroded quickly, and the city that had welcomed the world turned on its foreign residents with shocking violence. This historical pattern repeats across time and space. Diverse societies tend to be tolerant when they are successful, and turn xenophobic when they are frightened. Understanding this pattern does not make it less tragic, but it does suggest that sustaining cosmopolitanism requires not just good intentions, but also maintaining the material conditions, security, prosperity, opportunity, that make tolerance seem advantageous rather than threatening. The relationship between economic systems and cultural achievement that Tang Dynasty Chang'an exemplifies also speaks to contemporary questions. The city's cultural flowering depended on surplus wealth generated by long-distance trade and efficient agricultural production. Without that economic foundation, the poetry and painting and religious institutions that we admire would not have been possible. This seems to confirm the materialist view that culture is downstream from economics, that if you want artistic achievement, you first need prosperity. But the Tang Dynasty experience complicates this simple formula. The greatest cultural achievements came not during the most prosperous period, but during the crisis years, when the economic foundation was crumbling and the future looked bleak. Du Fu wrote his masterpieces while struggling to feed his family. The Chan Buddhist breakthrough happened when people were searching for meaning amid catastrophe. This suggests that the relationship between wealth and culture is not straightforward, that prosperity creates opportunities but crisis creates urgency, and that perhaps the highest human achievements require both the leisure that wealth provides and the existential pressure that suffering imposes. The Tang Dynasty's treatment of women offers another uncomfortable mirror for contemporary debates about gender equality. We can celebrate the relative freedom Tang women enjoyed compared to later Chinese dynasties, but we must also acknowledge how limited that freedom was, how it existed primarily for elite women, and how easily it was eroded when social conditions changed. Progress toward equality is not linear or guaranteed, and rights once granted can be taken away when powerful interests feel threatened. The women who managed property and wrote poetry, and participated in public life during the Tang dynasty, could not imagine that future generations of Chinese women would face much stricter restrictions, yet that is exactly what happened. This historical pattern suggests that fights for equality must be constantly renewed, that each generation must defend and extend the gains of previous generations, and that complacency is dangerous. The freedoms Tang women enjoyed were lost, partly because nobody systematically defended them, because the conservative opposition remained organised and committed while supporters of women's rights took their gains for granted. The lesson for contemporary movements for equality is clear: victories are never final, and what seems secure can become vulnerable surprisingly quickly when social conditions shift. The environmental degradation around Tang Dynasty Chang'an, the deforestation and air pollution and water contamination that accompanied the city's growth, also resonates with contemporary concerns. Pre-modern cities lacked the technology to destroy the environment on the scale that modern industrial civilization can manage, but they still caused significant local damage. The Tang Dynasty government recognized some of these problems and attempted to manage them through regulation, but economic pressures and population growth constantly outpaced administrative capacity. The city consumed resources faster than they could be renewed, creating unsustainable dependencies that contributed to its eventual decline. This pattern of environmental degradation accompanying urban growth suggests that sustainability requires not just good intentions or better technology, but fundamental constraints on consumption and population that societies have rarely been willing to impose voluntarily. The Tang Dynasty could have limited Chang'an's population, could have restricted the cutting of forests, could have enforced stricter pollution controls, but doing so would have required accepting lower economic growth and less imperial grandeur. The choice was never seriously considered, and the environmental costs were simply borne by future generations. Perhaps the deepest lesson from Tang Dynasty Chang'an is about the relationship between ideals and reality, between the world we aspire to create and the world we actually inhabit. The Tang poets wrote about a city of perfect harmony, where differences dissolved in shared appreciation of beauty and wisdom. The reality was messier, more conflicted, marked by exploitation and violence and deep inequalities that poetry chose not to see. Yet the ideals mattered precisely because they were not real. They provided a vision of what could be, a standard against which to measure actual conditions, a direction toward which society could strive even if it never quite arrived. We still need such visions, still need to imagine cities where diversity strengthens rather than divides, where culture flourishes and opportunity extends across classes and communities, where the beauty created by human hands and minds endures and enriches lives across generations. The fact that Tang Dynasty Chang'an failed to sustain its golden age does not invalidate the vision. It confirms that the vision is worth pursuing, even though success is never guaranteed, even though the best we can hope for is temporary achievement that must be constantly renewed, and eventually will be lost and must be rediscovered by future generations who face the same challenges. We face the same choices between openness and closure, between risk and safety, between building something magnificent that will not last or building nothing and having nothing to remember. The physical city that was Tang Dynasty Chang'an is gone, buried beneath modern Xi'an or ploughed into agricultural fields or simply dissolved back into the earth from which it rose 13 centuries ago. The walls have mostly vanished, recycled into later constructions or crumbled into unrecognizable mounds. The palaces exist only as foundation stones that archaeologists painstakingly excavate and measure. The broad avenues that once carried thousands are now invisible beneath parking lots and apartment buildings. The wards where Persians and Arabs and Koreans and Chinese lived in complicated proximity are marked only by subtle variations in soil density that ground-penetrating radar can detect. Yet the city endures in ways that matter more than physical survival. It endures in poetry, in the verses of Li Bai and Du Fu and Wang Wei and Bai Juyi that Chinese students still memorize, still recite, still find meaning in despite the vast gulf of time separating their world from the Tang dynasty. The poems capture something about human experience that transcends historical particulars, the loneliness of being far from home, the melancholy of watching seasons change, the joy of friendship and the pain of parting, the strange mixture of wonder and fear that comes from living in a world larger and more complex than you can fully understand. These emotions are not unique to Tang Dynasty China. They are human constants, and the poems speak across centuries because they found language adequate to experiences that remain recognizable. The city endures in art, in the paintings and calligraphy and ceramic sculptures that museums around the world treasure and display. Tang Dynasty aesthetics, the preference for fluid lines and naturalistic forms and harmonious composition, influenced East Asian art for 1,000 years and continues to shape contemporary artists working in traditional styles. When a modern Japanese potter throws a tea bowl, when a Korean calligrapher writes characters with brush and ink, when a Chinese landscape painter depicts mountains emerging from mist, they are drawing on traditions that crystallized during the Tang Dynasty, that found in Chang'an the resources and audience and cultural confidence to achieve definitive forms. The city endures in religious practice, in the Chan Buddhist meditation techniques developed during the Tang Dynasty that spread to Japan as Zen and eventually reached the West, where millions of people who have never heard of Chang'an practice mindfulness and seated meditation descended from methods refined 13 centuries ago. The Buddhist temples across East Asia, from Korea to Japan to Vietnam, often follow architectural patterns established during the Tang Dynasty. The chanting and ritual that monks perform today preserves elements of Tang Buddhist practice. The religion itself has changed enormously, adapted to countless local contexts, yet the threads connecting contemporary Buddhism to its Tang Dynasty, flowering, remain visible to those who know where to look. The city endures in political and administrative systems, in the examination-based bureaucracy that China maintained until the early 20th century, and that influenced civil service reform movements across Asia and eventually in Europe. The idea that government officials should be selected through competitive testing of intellectual merit rather than through birth or political connections traces directly to Tang Dynasty practice. Though the Tang did not invent the examination system, they perfected it in ways that made it central to Chinese governance. The legacy is mixed. The examination system created opportunities for talented individuals, but also ossified into a conservative force that resisted innovation. Yet its influence on how modern societies think about meritocracy and education remains profound. The city endures in the geographic patterns of modern China, in the networks of cities and trade routes and cultural connections that first achieved mature form during the Tang Dynasty. The Silk Road is no longer the primary artery of East-West trade, but the cities that grew wealthy from that trade remain important centres. The Grand Canal, though rebuilt and rerouted multiple times, still functions as a transportation artery. The cultural dominance of northern China that characterized the Tang Dynasty eventually shifted south, where economic dynamism concentrated after the empire's fall, but the north-south integration that made Chang'an possible remains a defining feature of Chinese civilization. Most subtly, but perhaps most importantly, the city endures as an idea, a possibility, a demonstration that human beings can build something genuinely cosmopolitan if they choose to, that differences of ethnicity and religion and language need not inevitably lead to conflict, that diversity can be a source of vitality rather than weakness. This idealized Chang'an, the city of poetry and imagination, probably never existed in quite the form we like to remember. The real city was dirtier, more violent, more unequal, more fractured than the golden vision suggests. Yet the vision matters precisely because it shows what human beings aspire to, what we think civilization should look like at its best. Every generation rediscovers Tang Dynasty Chang'an and finds in it something relevant to contemporary concerns. Chinese nationalists in the early 20th century, struggling against foreign imperialism, looked back to the Tang Dynasty as proof that China had once been the greatest civilization on Earth and could be again. Cosmopolitan intellectuals in the late 20th century, arguing for openness to foreign ideas, pointed to Tang Dynasty tolerance as a native Chinese tradition rather than a Western import. Artists seeking to revive traditional culture study Tang Dynasty aesthetics. Political reformers debate whether Tang Dynasty institutions offer models for contemporary governance. The city becomes a mirror in which each age sees what it wants to see, and this endless reinterpretation is itself a kind of immortality. The archaeologists continue their patient work, excavating another foundation, analysing another pottery fragment, reconstructing another piece of the vast puzzle. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding, but the full picture will never be complete. Too much has been lost, destroyed by time and warfare, and the simple fact that wood and paper and human memory are fragile things that rarely survive across centuries. We will never walk through the West Market as it actually was, never hear Tang Dynasty music as contemporary ears heard it, never know exactly what it felt like to live in the world's largest city when empires sent tribute and poets gathered in wine shops, and the future seemed to stretch bright and boundless ahead. But we can imagine, an imagination informed by careful scholarship and archaeological evidence, and sympathetic reading of surviving texts can sometimes come close to truth. We can picture the young examination candidate arriving in the city for the first time, overwhelmed by its scale and energy. We can envision the Persian merchant explaining his strange god to curious Chinese neighbours. We can see the singing girl performing in a crowded tavern, while scholars debate poetry at nearby tables. We can follow the emperor's procession through broad avenues while commoners press against barriers, hoping for a glimpse of the Son of Heaven. These imagined scenes are not history in the strict sense, but they are not fiction either. They are attempts to honour the lived experience of people whose individual stories have vanished but whose collective achievement shaped the world we inherit. The sun sets over modern Xi'an, and somewhere beneath the traffic and construction and million daily dramas of contemporary urban life, the ghosts of Tang Dynasty Chang'an rest in patient darkness, waiting for the next archaeologist's shovel, the next scholar's insight, the next generation's questions about how human beings can live together across differences, can create beauty that endures beyond individual lives, can build cities that become not just centres of power and commerce, but also, however briefly, homes for the human spirit at its most expansive and generous and hopeful. The city is gone, but its legacy remains, whispering across centuries that it was done once, and therefore might be done again, that the cosmopolitan dream is not impossible but merely difficult, and that difficulty has never been sufficient reason for human beings to stop trying.